Welcome to the Scrum.org Community Podcast, a podcast from the home of Scrum. In this podcast, we feature professional Scrum trainers and other Scrum practitioners sharing their stories and experiences to help learn from the experience of others. We hope you enjoy this episode.
Hello and welcome to Scrum.org Community Podcast, a podcast from the home of Scrum. My name's Dave West, CEO here at Scrum.org, and I'll be your host today. In this podcast, normally we feature professional Scrum trainers and other Scrum practitioners sharing their stories and experiences around Scrum so that maybe we can all learn together. Today's podcast, though, is a little different. It's a third installment. Actually, we were laughing before we got on air that maybe this time we'll get it right? It's the third installment on Agile leadership with the authors of the Professional Agile Leadership book. So welcome to the podcast, Kurt Bittner, Lawrence Bonnema, Ron Eringa. Welcome, gentlemen.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And as I said, it's the third time, so hopefully we'll be better this time, right? Practice makes perfect. So over the last two podcasts, we've talked about agile leadership. You know, we've really focused on what it is, why it's different from maybe more traditional leadership perspectives, and how organizations can and should embrace the ideas into their leadership discipline. Today's podcast, I think I would like us to focus on a challenging topic, a topic that is very important to many people, which is hierarchy. And when I'm talking about hierarchy, I'm talking about it in two areas. One, the hierarchy in terms of the systems and processes of managing risk and decision-making and authority. And the second type of authority, which is hierarchy in terms of promotion, career, and money. So I guess the invitation or question that I'd like to start with is, how does a bottom-up, flatter view of the world, which Scrum and Agile really promotes, integrate with the reality of most traditional organizations? And Ron, this is a topic that you talk a lot about and are very wax lyrical on. So how could you sort of get us going on that question?
Yeah, so the integration question is actually one of the most interesting questions because, you know, in any organization where you start working with ideas of self-organizing teams, you're going to have to start with what is there, right? And I think we talked about this last time a little bit as well. But you can't avoid that there is a hierarchy there in the organization. Another thing, I think people also think that the hierarchy will be gone once you have self-organizing teams, which I think is probably also not there. But the hierarchy looks probably different. And I think that is the tension that you're going to work with when you start with self-organizing teams and Scrum teams. So you will have the traditional hierarchy, which is normally kind of a power hierarchy in the organization, meaning that everyone that's up in the food chain, higher up the hierarchy, will make decisions about money, about careers, about, you know, everything actually. But at the moment that you really get mature, agile, self-organizing teams, a lot of those traditional responsibilities start shifting towards actually the people doing the work. But that doesn't mean that hierarchy will disappear in the organization. It's just going to look different. So in the old organization, people up in the food chain, higher up the hierarchy, are responsible for, well, almost every decision. And in the new organization, they will be responsible for helping people to take those decisions themselves. And I think that's a much harder job because they're going to have to make sure that those people are actually capable of doing that they have all the means to do so, and that they, you know, that the organization is still an organization. So I think the hierarchy won't disappear. It's just, you know, it's replaced. The power hierarchy will probably be replaced by a hierarchy of concerns, making sure that the organization as a whole will still keep functioning and that people are capable of continuing to make the decisions that they were taking in the past.
So I just want to pick up on those two quite important points. Number one, that ultimately authority is changing from making decisions about stuff to helping others make decisions about stuff, which I think is really, really interesting. So that's one point. And then you brought up another interesting point about how, I guess, it'll work, and the reality of the transition, which I think is really, really interesting as well. Let's talk a little bit about the first point. So decisions used to be made, supposedly, you'd have multiple meetings, somebody would be invited to a meeting, the team would present something, that person would say yes or no, or that person would then take it to somebody else, right? Who would then say yes and no, who would then take it to somebody else who would say yes and no, depending on the severeness of the decision, the bigness, if that's a word, of the decision, it would go up and down. That's changing. How does it manifest itself? How does it work, in terms of decision making and the like? What does a agile leader have to do that's different?
I can give an example of that if you want to. During the COVID crisis that we had in the last few years, I was interim manager in an organization, and at some point we needed to cut budget, which in the end 9 out of 10 times means letting people go. And in this case, there were people that were hired, external hires, that we needed to cut down like 40 people or something. In the traditional organization, what would have happened, and this is actually what actually happened in the organization before we started experimenting with this, is the manager would take the decision which people that we needed to let go. And then it just tripped down into the rest of the organization. Yeah. What we did instead is we went to the product owners and the scrum masters of the team with the problem that we had. That this is the problem that we have. We need your help with that. Could you help us find the solution? Because if I'm going to make the decision, I'm probably going to make the worst decision ever, because I'm going to break up, all the dynamics and all the teams, and we didn't want to do that. So in the end, what happened is that they had those conversations. They came up with a lot of great solutions, not only solutions like letting people go, but also, proposals that we didn't even think of. So I think because we involved the people in the problem, they came up with much better solutions than probably I would have come up with. But I think the biggest gain that we had is that, people told me afterwards, like, this was the first time that I was involved in such a big problem. And normally the manager would have all that weight on his shoulders, and now we were, all carrying that same weight. So I think, we are talking about people that are all capable of taking these kind of decisions. But if they're not used to that, probably I have to support them in doing it. And of course, that's what I did. So it didn't mean that I, wasn't involved in the whole process, but the process went completely different. And my role is very different in that.
Wow, that sounds pretty scary. Yeah. Kurt, what do you think? I mean, suddenly you're sort of going from being responsible to enabling. How does that, that sounds, to make decisions about whether to lay people off or where to change, money and the like is scary. So how does it actually work? Don't people get kind of like worried about those responsibilities and those accountabilities? How does it all fit together? Kurt, do you have anything to share?
Yeah, well, to continue on with what Ron was saying, and to use that example, I've been involved in a couple of situations that were kind of similar, and the things that the team needs from a leader in that situation is essentially kind of guidance and coaching. So there are certain proposals or things that they might think of that you can't do for legal reasons. There are other things that you might ask, well, have you considered this? They're focused on one set of impacts, but the organization has other ones. So they might say, well, we could just cut customer support. I'm using a bad example, but you can say, well, we could just cut that and have the team handle that. And the leader might say, well, that might be a good way to go, but it's going to mean you're going to get interrupted all the time. Is that something that you think you want to take on? So helping the team think through decisions and helping them grow their ability to make those decisions is really important. And, you know, as Ron said, the teams were able to come up with lots of ideas that the management would not have come up with. But the teams maybe don't have all the visibility into various issues that they might want to have. You know, maybe there's well, you know, we tried to do that 5 years ago. We had these particular challenges, and you know, we don't want to go through that again. So so it's more helping, you know, switching from telling the team what to do to helping them think things through, helping them consider different perspectives. You know, there in most countries, there are lots of laws about diversity. And so a particular decision may not look particularly diverse, even though, you know, it was done for solid reasons, but you might want to consider that. So that's sort of the shift, is that it actually, you know, our view is that this shift away from decision making actually enables the leaders to become more impactful because they have greater influence and they have greater flexibility. But the job is very different. Instead of being the big decider and, you know, sitting in the rooms, you know, with all the other big deciders, you know, you involve more people and you focus more on teaching, much in the way that a parent would try to help a child learn how to make better decisions, as opposed to telling them what to do.
So I'd like to, you know, there's another element around hierarchy other than decisions, but also in terms of career. So Lawrence, you know, does this mean that you don't, how do career paths look if we suddenly are if suddenly we're all a bunch of coaches, teachers, mentors, parents, helping people grow and develop? How does that work in terms of promotion, hierarchy, and career sort of perspective? Do you have much experience there when you're working with clients? What do you tell them when they say, how do I get promoted in this new world?
Yeah, as a matter of fact, we do. We have some experience in working with clients, talk through those kinds of changes, where what we find the most interesting thing to do is, instead of linear progression, where you have like a sort of a function house, right? So you start as a Scrum Master, and then you move on to become an Agile coach, and then you move on and you become the king of Scrum, right? But well, it's already a taken position, but you never know. Yeah. Anyway, there is like a linear path. So take these steps, and then you'll get there. And that's no longer true if you work in this way. So hierarchy changes, becomes more of a networked structure. And as weird as it may sound, it's more like a bingo card, right? A full career is several slots that you can fill, and you can go both linear, you could go in a different line. So it's more like a journey, and you can draw the map yourself. And that tends to be a little bit more complicated. But in the end, you can, even from an HR perspective, we find you can simplify that back down again and literally make it into a bingo card. I have 7 check marks wherever they are, and that means this is my compensation. And that actually, we thought that was oversimplifying it, and it would probably not work, but let's try it anyway. That worked brilliant to several of the customers that we work with. And that's really interesting because it also answers a very complex question, or at least it fixes the fact that we always give very complex answers to essentially a simple question, which is, okay, I have all this experience. What does that get me? And if I take a different step in my career, does that mean I'm throwing away all that experience? And if you work in this way, if you structure it this way, you don't necessarily have to. And that really helps in what you need in that different type of hierarchy, in that different type of situation. You need people who have experience in multiple places in an organization and can then navigate the hierarchy more effectively, because it becomes more of a network instead of a fixed linear thing.
Okay, so yes, I think so. Let me see if I get it right. And then I'd love, I'd love some other viewpoints on this. So basically what you're saying is that ultimately the skills that you develop are like this big list or bingo card, as you describe it. And you knock off these skills and these competencies and these capabilities, lots of words describe this, and ultimately you are paid, promoted in inverted commas, in terms as you progress across this bingo card, filling things out as you go, which then, which is awesome because it also removes this concept of, I think it's an expression, and maybe Kurt, you've heard it, the Peter principle, is it? Where you get promoted to a level of your own level of incompetence because ultimately you show an amazing skill at doing X and Y. They put you into the next level, which is completely different. You know, I certainly know that my person management skills have, you know, I got promoted into that and I'm like, well, I don't know what to do here. I was just very good at reasonably averagely good at what I did before. And now you've promoted me into a different position, which I'm no good at, or maybe I have to just learn to be good at, which is going to take some time. So is that what you were saying, Lawrence?
Yeah, exactly. That now it is no longer a bad thing to recognize that and say, well, look, I have all this experience. Now I'm going to move laterally instead of back down or further up, because this is not my place. This is not where I add most value. And I think that I can add more value there. And of course, this is all discussion, right? So you talk about this with your boss, with your peers, with the people who work for you, whatever position you have, and then you decide and move. Usually, that is a very personal decision. If you have, and maybe the bingo card is not the right metaphor, but if it's like a matrix or something that you're filling out, if it's more of a matrix, and you can essentially take any path, and you have defined that as part of your organization, it makes it easier to make those kinds of decisions because they don't cost you anything. It becomes additive, and that is freeing, not just for the person involved. It's also freeing for tons of HR departments and for people managing them in creating fixed paths, knowing full well that almost nobody takes them, right? Because most people almost by accident are hired for a position that they may not even have considered, and then either discover that they really rock that, or that they're stuck in the Peter principle, and then they start wondering, when will they find out that I'm actually not good at this? And what will then happen? Because sadly, of course, with the Peter principle, usually you are indeed promoted to your level of incompetence, and then you stay there, which is a disservice to both the organization and the person. So it's way better to make it normal, to just try, see if you can do that, and if you like doing that. And then if the answer is, nah, it's probably not a great idea if you stay here, then you just shift. And different hierarchical thinking makes that possible because it is hierarchical thinking that keeps us stuck in those, I have to go up. And every time I take a different decision, it means I'm going down. As opposed to, as I go up, I could also go left and right and a little bit down. And it really doesn't matter because I'm just marking the check boxes of everything I have done. And therefore, everything I am now uniquely qualified to do in this organization.
So, Kurt, I'd love your take on this.
Yeah, so that cross-functional, just like teams are cross-functional in terms of their skills, having leaders be cross-functional in different areas is important. But one thing I think that's really important too is that as decisions get pushed down to teams, the need for levels in the hierarchy to specialize around functions declines. So you don't have let's say over the long term, a manager of software development or a manager of testing or these other functional areas. And actually keep having the hierarchy organized around functions makes the organization less adaptable because you're sort of locking in certain kinds of expertise. So the other thing that happens over time is that there's as responsibility for certain kinds of decisions gets pushed down to the teams, then that hierarchy starts to focus more, I think, on the scope of its influence. So at sort of at the level above the teams, that leader might have, might be helping a handful of teams, and above that, their scope is much broader. So they're helping, whole sort of product groups and so on. So that scope becomes, or what the leader does is less focused on making decisions on a particular area, functional area, and more focused on how do we get these larger groups of people working together more effectively, and their scope becomes that. Then, and related to that, then is the scope of the goals of those leaders. Might be focused on at lower levels, groups of teams, then products, then perhaps the entire organization. So that shift happens gradually, but it's happens sort of in parallel with the teams taking on more responsibility for the day-to-day decisions and for technical decisions and even product decisions. And but there's, there are lots of things that happen between teams, and that often, that can self-manage to a point, but oftentimes it requires somebody to sort of, help out with, maybe some broader conflicts between different sets of goals, or aligning goals, or doing things like that. So that's what I think is the shift away from functional organization toward a more scope of leadership kind of organization.
So you can imagine what my last question will be, and I'd like to hit this up to Ron. Okay, so I'm currently working in a functionally aligned organization where my promotion is supported by a very comprehensive competence model that was developed 15 years ago and that has been ratified by a works council and a trade union and a whatever, and it's all been signed off. What do I do? How do I get promoted? How do I deal with this? You talked about duality, you talked about to operate, how do I deal with this? What's your message to these people that are currently in this transition sort of state? How do they manage these two worlds?
And maybe again, to use a practical application where we started experimenting with this would be like, people need to still pay their mortgage, right? So that's one thing. So, and people are still going to be looking for how to get more of that stuff. So, I can buy a bigger house, and, that's typical behavior. However, if you start decoupling the monetary reward from someone's place in the hierarchy by, for example, creating team rewards that are coupled to actually the value creation that's being done to customers. If the team can couple their monetary rewards to their successes they book with customers, if it's really like in a value chain where they can see the amount of value that they're creating, and it also, typically drills down to making more money, why don't we just couple that actually to how a real business also works, right? If a business is doing good, everyone in the business will profit from that. If you start decoupling those individual reward systems, replace it by team rewards, but also, remove the place in the hierarchy kind of discussion, we have found that people will start asking better questions as well. They will start wondering, how can I, still make more money, but by doing the right stuff for customers instead of, fighting to get that place somewhere up in food chain in this organization. So I think that's basically what we saw in these experiments, is that at the moment that you start experimenting with team rewards, anyone can be rewarded regardless of their place in the hierarchy. And that just gives much better discussions and also different focus for people. So we've had some very interesting results with that, at least by running these kind of experiments.
And just folding in what Kurt said about this sort of like degrees of influence, sort of higher view, and then balancing team rewards with some sort of, because you still want to incentivize people to help cross teams, deal with these conflicts, sort of as, these challenges. So balancing that kind of those two worlds in some sort of very explicit, very very transparent manner, I guess. Would you agree? Is that those two things have to be balanced?
I think yes, they definitely need to be balanced in combination with the fact, well, and that's where your question started. Like, now we have this, very rigid HR system. How are we going to change that? Well, my advice would be don't change the entire HR system right away. Start looking at your most mature team and run some experiments and see how that works out. And you'll probably learn what works best for the organization step by step. So taking an empirical approach instead of, trying to, reshift the entire way that the whole HR system works is also probably not the best way to go forward with that.
Yes, makes a lot of sense. Incrementally, slowly, looking at those friction points, not making decisions that like we're going to radically change everybody's how people are paid and salaries, etc. overnight, but maybe we'll run two models and look at how they work together, and then incrementally make those changes. All right, we try to keep these podcasts short. And obviously a topic of this breadth we could go on for hours talking about all sorts of things. So I really do appreciate you taking the time out of today. We've been listening to Kurt Bittner, Lawrence Bonnema, and Ron Eringa talking a little bit about hierarchy, talking about how that features in agile leadership and how to marry these two worlds of flatter, sort of more agile organizations, more outcome-oriented organizations with traditional organizations. Obviously, we couldn't cover everything, and if you've got some interest in this, maybe everybody should read the book. It's a fantastic read, Professional Agile Leadership, part of the Professional Scrum series from Pearson. So, gentlemen, thank you for taking the time again to talk about these topics. It is a big one, and hopefully we'll continue this conversation in the future.
It's been
You're welcome.
Thanks, Dave. 3 is a charm.